Yeah, I think we'll start. I think we've kind of slowed down. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today um, and to get an update on our IonE impact goals and kind of what's been going on. So the bulk of what's been going on for the last couple quarters actually has been really issuing the impact goal request for proposals that went out in January. We had 31 responses to that from across the system. And from that, we had a group of IonE fellows, some outside reviewers, people working on the impact goal teams, narrow that down to 13, and those 13 people presented in early June to another review panel composed of similar people, but also some people from outside the university. We had a reviewer from DNR, some from the external advisory board of IonE, and we selected 6 finalists out of that. When we started this process, we had been looking at between 5 and 8 people that we would select. I think we really went to the lower side because of all the things that happened in the interim with the pandemic and budget cuts, et cetera. But I'm really excited about the 6 that we selected. These were all really great proposals, all the people that applied. So it wasn't particularly easy to narrow that list down in any way. So today we're going to really open it up to these 6 grant recipients. They will have a chance to give a few slides, talk a little bit, and then we'll open it up for questions, just so people have a chance to understand and get a chance to see a little bit more about what's going on with these. So just as to refresh your memory on what the RFP was and what the goals were. So we requested proposals for approximately 50K grants. They had to be engaged scholarship. You had to have a community partner on your team. We are very broad in thinking about what that community partner could be. And we saw a pretty broad range, right? Ranging from large and small NGOs to government agencies to municipalities to a really broad range, and in tribal nations as well. So it was really great to see that range. And they ranged from teams that have been working together for a long time to ones that really came together for this set of proposals. So that was great. And we were really focusing around a couple things. One, around land use and agriculture, both for these first 2 goals that you see there for carbon neutral Minnesota and envisioning sustainable land use. So that's why you'll see some of the ones that you saw. On the drinking water side, it was really focused around source water protection and potential impacts of climate change going forward. So with that, I am going to introduce the first team. So the process is going to be that we have about 10 minutes for each one of these. I'll turn it over to one of the PIs. They can talk a little bit, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And you will have to either chat in your question or raise your hand so I can see that and call on you. Looks like we have about 40 people online, so that should be pretty manageable. So with that, I am going to unshare, and I am going to turn it over to Susanna. Are you ready?
Yep, I'm on, and I'm gonna share my screen, and I'm gonna go through just a couple of our slides quickly. I don't want to waste too much time on the slides. So I'm working with Jennifer Schmidt and Nat Springer, both with Institute on the Environment. And our project is, can green bonds finance greenhouse gas mitigation in the Minnesota dairy industry? So I'm sure everyone is pretty well aware of the GHG intensity of agriculture. And that's the basic problem that we started from. Dairy farms are a significant contributor to this problem. Minnesota is an incredibly large dairy producing state. And as I learned from talking to Nat and Jennifer, a number of solutions already exist that could potentially mitigate some of the GHG intensity of dairy farms. The problem is that dairy farmers, particularly after COVID-19, they simply do not have the financial capacity to make the necessary investments. And so what we're hoping to do is try to connect these farmers to a growing pool of capital. So my background is actually on the investment side. I've spent my entire career in institutional asset management, and there is a growing interest in investing in impact or ESG, environmental, social, and governance related activities. The fund that I work with at Carlson is a PRI signatory, and we collectively manage assets for the university, but we also are a pool of PRI signatories across the globe. And so there's been an enormous surge in appetite for instruments called green bonds. And green bonds have been used by corporations, municipalities, NGOs to finance investments in a wide range of environmental and social projects. And so what we're hoping to do in our project is connect the dairy farmers to this pool of capital. We believe that green bonds can be used to fund some of these necessary improvements. There are certain requirements that the green bonds need to meet, but we think that most of the investments we're talking about would be considered acceptable use of proceeds for green bond qualification. We are going to be working with the World Wildlife Fund. I was unaware of what an enormous agricultural practice World Wildlife Fund has, so I'm excited to spend time working with our partner. They're going to be helping us to connect with the dairy stakeholder group. So part of the project is trying to understand which solutions make sense from a farmer standpoint. And then we're going to be collecting with the financial community. We need to understand which solutions also make sense from an investor standpoint, and we really want to try to bridge those two worlds. So we're going to be focused on basically environmental and financial impact modeling of a variety of different solutions. And I think the power of this project comes from looking across the dairy stakeholders. We really want to get away from a world where dairy farmers themselves are individually responsible for making the capital investments necessary to reduce GHG emissions. We want to look at this as a systemic problem, and we think that green bonds can be one way of facilitating this. So I'm going to pause there. I don't want to spend too much time talking about my slides. I'd really like to hear what people's questions are. So I think I'll pause on that. I've got a bunch of other slides we can jump to if there are specific questions, but maybe I'll just turn it back to Fred and we can have some Q&A.
Yeah, like I said, feel free to chat in or raise your hand electronically. I can call on you. I can't see everybody here, so but I do have the list of participants up.
Maybe, Susanna, we should stop sharing and then we can see people and their questions easier.
Oh, sure. Yep. Here we go. All right.
So this is Chris right here. I've got a question. So these types of greenhouse gas reduction projects would qualify for carbon offset payments. So is one of the ideas to use the green bonds to do the upfront work necessary to get involved in the carbon market?
Yes. Yeah, that's going to be probably one of the critical components of repayment for the green bonds. So green bonds can raise the capital, but there needs to be either expense reductions or some revenue stream associated with the investments to service the bonds. And so carbon payments would have to be a really important source of payment for the bonds. And so, you know, to the extent that there are other experts on the call, and I know there are other projects that are looking at carbon credits, that's something that it would be great to sort of touch base on and collaborate with other people as we move forward.
Susanna, this is Lissa Polish. You and I have been introduced via email. I loved your comment that you just made about we want to get away from a world in which dairy farmers themselves are responsible for these payments and these investments.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering how you all are thinking about like utilizing that supply chain. So like working with Land O'Lakes or CHS, and how you're thinking about how the dollars would flow from a bond through
Right.
those entities to the farmer and then back up. Just maybe say a little bit more about that.
So one of the things we have to think about is who the actual issuer of the bond is going to be. And so it's part of what we'll be working on is what makes the most sense in that regard. But it's entirely possible that Land O'Lakes could be, I don't want to put them on the spot, right? Because they're not even here, but to have Land O'Lakes be an issuer of the bond. And then Land O'Lakes would help deploy the capital. They would actually, if they were to issue the bond under their own credit, they're a highly rated entity. I think it would result in a lower cost of capital for all of the projects. And so they would be an important aggregator. So that's one possibility. Other possibilities for issuers of the bonds might be municipalities. So to the extent that there are municipal electric co-ops that might benefit from investing in an anaerobic digester, they might also be an issuer of the bonds. So it's the supply chain actually that ends up being probably the issuer of the bonds that we're talking about. Does that answer the question? Okay, thanks.
This is Deepak. There's a lot of research ongoing on having better crop feed for dairy. There's a lot of research going on in bringing to the market alfalfa, which results in less cow burp. And there's a company in Minnesota called Caltex, which is working actively on that. And they already have invested a lot of technology. I wonder how, if this project is going to somehow help in that aspect, the upstream, the feed aspect.
So I sort of skipped over the feed. Maybe I could ask Jennifer or Nat to weigh in on that.
Yeah, so one of the things by having these aggregators is we can help think about one farmer switching their feed, number one, is difficult from bringing those other feeds into a market system and making it expensive to have them. But then if you aggregate up and it's someone like Target, McDonald's, Land O'Lakes says we want to see these reductions and we think you can do this through feed, and then they say, well, we need more silos to have that particular feed, or we need an additional container in our feed mill to be able to put that feed as part of the mix, or whatever those bigger capital things are that an individual farmer can't really easily do to just change feed. I mean, we think it's easy, but it's actually can get quite complicated. This can allow such that aggregation around what is needed, the capital needed to truly implement those changes in feed, and then not just at one farmer, but many farmers, so that we can see those bigger reductions.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Deepak, I mean, that's a good example of a solution in a whole wide bucket of solutions that we're going to want to try to consider. I think, there's a lot of things different folks are trying. Diets are huge. I know I just saw something that Burger King the other day was doing something with lemongrass. I mean, a lot of folks are trying to do these things. And so it's a good time to do this because I think the number of solutions is growing. And so that gives flexibility and different approaches in different places. And then we can build that into this kind of, farmer initiative to figure out, well, what really is the best low-hanging fruit here.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I think we had a chance to get through there.
Yeah, hi,
Great.
this is Jeff Stanish.
I'm sorry.
Greg, can I
Yep,
just jump in
go ahead.
quickly?
Short question,
So
yep.
Susanna, thanks for your presentation. Excited to hear about the project. I just wanted to mention two things quickly. One, Excel Energy has a request for information out right now around anaerobic digestion. I don't know if you guys were aware of that.
I was not aware of the RFI, so thank you.
It's actually extended till the end of this week if you're interested in submitting information about partnering with them.
Okay.
One of the things that I've been talking with them about, and actually Jessica Hellman was on a call just yesterday about it, was the monitoring of methane around AD operations and the modeling. So, you know, thinking about with you all how this fits into the Green Bonds project, I think will be important. You know, manure management I saw on the slide there. And the other thing is the anaerobic digestion conversation is something that is ramping up here through some of the work that I'm doing. And so I think there's some real opportunities here across the state to collaborate on these opportunities to make sure that everybody's sort of on the same page for renewable natural gas, especially.
That's
Cool.
great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Those are great. And that's why, you know, it's good to bring all of you together. All right. So thanks, Susanna, Jennifer, Nat. We're going to move on to the next one. This is community land and food gatherings. And I believe Jennifer Nicklay is going to do the presentation. Is that correct?
That's me.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Let me just find the window to share. I'm sure, like everybody else, you have a distressing number of windows open on your computer at any given time. And let me get into present mode. And we're good to go. Okay, as Fred said, my name is Jennifer Nicklay, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate, and I'm here today representing our team, including the academic partners, Nick Jelinski and Mary Rogers and Kat Levine here at the University of Minnesota, Chip Small at the University of St. Thomas, and Valentine Cadieux at Hamlin University, and our community partners, Ethan Neal and Mel Trent at White House, Taya Schultz and Seamus Fitzgerald at Growing Lots Urban Farm, Melvin Giles and Mary Zhang and Nate Galloway at the Urban Farm and Garden Alliance, and Tiffany Lachey, an independent farmer. Today, I'm excited to share with you our plan for community land and food gatherings centered around translating and applying urban agriculture research in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So urban agriculture promotes adaptation and increases resilience, but many focus on yield or calories produced as the sole metric of importance for measuring impact, but it can also serve as urban green infrastructure strategy, increasing soil, carbon, and water storage, and is used by communities for youth education, intergenerational connection, and green space, all of which increase resilience and help individuals and communities transform and adapt to changes, whether that's a pandemic, a social crisis, or climate change. Therefore, our research program focuses on exploring the socio-ecological drivers and impacts of urban agriculture using an ecosystem service framework. We are in the final year of our current on-farm project, which is funded by a USDA NCR SARE grant. And so in addition to crop yield, we're also doing things like tracking nutrients through the system. What are the nutrient levels in the soil? How does that correspond to the nutrients that make it past the rooting zone into water? And what sorts of nutrients are being released into the atmosphere via soil respiration? And those are just a few examples of things we're measuring. So we have an opportunity. Holistic perspectives allow us to make better decisions. And for example, here are some of our very preliminary visualizations of two different sites in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Noting that our project is not complete and data is not yet collected and analyzed completely, we can still see that these two sites are quite different, the result of different goals, resources, and challenges. Neither is right or wrong, and services and trade-offs are not predetermined. It's vital to understand the diverse socio-ecological impacts in relationship to each other and to grow our goals. However, these are also incredibly complex data sets, and it's challenging to translate and apply them to management practices and policy decisions. Our approach to address that is to plan and execute a series of community land and food gatherings with the purpose of creating participatory processes to translate and apply research. The framework for these proposed activities was co-developed with practitioners and community members, and all proposed activities represent direct engagement strategies. However, the work done in each will be amplified by our community partners and participants, expanding the impact and actions that emerge from our activities. The kernel of these activities is bi-monthly gatherings throughout the project period with our core group of practitioner collaborators. The goals of these gatherings are to leverage practitioner and researcher knowledge to co-create data analysis and application strategies. In summer 2021, we'll host a 2-week half-day summer workshop with a cohort of 20 farmer practitioners and policymakers who will be compensated for their time. The goal is to begin creating tools that help communities and policymakers make land use decisions. And building on the practices and tools developed in those gatherings and workshops, in 2022, we'll host the Community Research Summit for 100+ growers, community members, organizers, and policymakers, with the goal to identify necessary changes and initiate actions for land use decisions at multiple scales. Throughout 2020, new challenges have arisen, but that has made it even more clear how vital this work is. COVID-19 has made it difficult to gather in person, so until we can, our community land and food gatherings will be conducted virtually, building on similar techniques that our community partners have already mobilized to connect with their own neighborhoods. Our community partners, our work, and we ourselves, the academic partners, have been deeply impacted by the murder of George Floyd. Systemic racism pervades our society and affects our partners and us every day. As seen on the slide, our partners have used existing community gathering spaces, their farms and gardens, to support community members who were cut off from their homes, businesses, and essential services this summer. When we think about the impact of this grant on our work, our community partners are already doing the work and are already having the impact. Rather than this project being the sole source of their empowerment, our goal is to support community partners in leveraging research as one tool to build on their existing practices and increase the scope and visibility of those impacts for others. And with that, from our entire team, we thank you for the opportunity to share our work with you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Jennifer. It's a big team.
We sure are, and we get bigger. It feels like every day, and it changes a lot too. I could pull up a diagram, but we have a network base of over probably 150 people that we can either directly connect with ourselves as an academic team, or people, or like direct collaborators that our community partners work with. And so
yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah,
very impressive. Questions?
So Jennifer, one of the things, as you were going through your slides, the project sounded really fascinating, and one of the things you mentioned was for your community partners to use information to think about land use changes, I think it was. I don't know if I'm using the right terminology. Just from someone who's not familiar with what options might be available, like what kind of decisions, could you give me just examples of like a practical decision that might be really important in their?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. On like an individual farm and garden scale, that could be as integral to a farm's operation as what amendments are they using. And so, for example, one of the amendments we've been studying is adding compost to the soil, which is like very popular, very much like it's almost a free resource, to be honest. And it's so great at bringing soils that used to be vacant lots, used to have buildings on top of them, used to be parking lots. It's really great at creating a place where food can grow abundantly. And there are also trade-offs. Like we're seeing that after several years, phosphorus tends to increase in the soil. Not to the point where we're worried yet that it would become a water pollutant necessarily. We don't think it's going that far from the sites. But they have other amendment choices. They could use brewer's mash, they could, which is the spent grain from brewing operations. They could use things like mulched comfrey, which many of them have access to. We have learned manure has so much phosphorus in it that most of our growers have, based on these preliminary results, stopped using manure. And so we've already seen changes, and that's just at an individual site scale. Land use decisions at a city scale include like what would be the benefits of having a farm on every block is one of my personal dreams. Like what kinds of services would that provide, whether it is yield, whether it is that gathering space, or whether it's things like helping create insect biodiversity. So from a more holistic land use planning perspective at a city scale, it can also be really helpful. I think I saw a chat come through. Oh, cool, Jeff, yeah, I'll connect.
So is there another question? Sorry. Comments? Jennifer, can you say a few words about, I mean, you mentioned it at the end a little bit about the impact, but you know, we've seen a lot of fragility in the food distribution network here between both COVID and the George Floyd aftermath. Can you say a few words about how you guys think about that and how this might help with some of those?
Absolutely. So I think COVID and the uprising have both demonstrated, like you said, the fragility of our food production and food distribution systems, and has highlighted that urban food production, one of the major benefits is preserving the knowledge of how to grow your own food and the infrastructure to grow your own food for moments like this, which are likely to become more and more common as we move through and climate change intensifies. What I've seen on the ground is that, for example, when in the first 2 weeks after the murder of George Floyd, growing lots started collecting food from rural farms to distribute to frontline protesters and community members who all their grocery stores had burned down. And they've continued that to a certain extent, though nonprofits that actually have the infrastructure to support that have finally been able to step up a little on that one. Weight House has massively increased its food production this year, which our research team was able to support as they actually transitioned farmers in the last week of May and first week of June. I planted one of their sites fully, so it's really exciting to see like all the food grow. And then Urban Farm and Garden Alliance has been making sure that we're able to get the word out and to collect resources and to also continue supporting neighborhood youth in Frogtown and Rondo who haven't been able to go to school, but now they have this virtual gardening program. So those are like just the ways that we've seen this summer. And with more resources like this, they're able to really increase their impact.
Any other questions? Otherwise, we can move on.
Yeah, I don't know if food deserts are a problem in the Twin Cities, but it seems like this can make a huge contribution to that issue.
This is one strategy to address problems with food access and food sovereignty. We tend to call them areas of food apartheid in our discussions, since areas without grocery stores and without access to culturally appropriate and healthy foods are generally structurally and systematically created through racist planning policies in the past and currently. And so food apartheid more accurately represents that, but this is a good strategy to increase people's food sovereignty, but it's definitely just one part of that. We want to see a world where the ease with which I go to a grocery store is also the ease with which somebody in North Minneapolis goes to a grocery store, for example, or now in the Lake Street area can go to a grocery store. But maybe in the future they'll be like some of the co-ops and they carry produce from some of the local farms, or there's local food neighborhood distribution networks like we're seeing the mutual aid really take off, and being able to share that abundance. So it's a really cool way to both address the inequalities we currently have and imagine new ways of relating to each other over food.
There's one short question here on the use of worm castings as a soil amendment. Can you give a really short answer? Because we need to move on.
Yeah, I personally use worm castings in my community garden and personal garden, but we have not been studying it, and there's actually not a ton of research for urban farms and gardens on it, largely because at least at the farm scale we've been working at so far, it would take a lot of worms to create enough castings for it. And our partners just don't have the capacity to have that big of a worm operation.
Okay, great, thanks. So we're gonna move on to the next one, forest carbon markets. Chris Wright is online and will give us the scoop on that. Thanks, over to you, Chris.
Okay, I just wanted to recognize the members of my team, Forrest Fleischman from the Department of Forest Resources, Marissa Schmitz from Minnesota Forest Resources Council and Department of Forest Resources, and then our community partners, Paul Sandstrom and John Beckwith from Minnesota Association of Resources Conservation and Development Councils. Okay, so the motivation for our project is the fact that Minnesota forests are underperforming in their ability to mitigate climate change. And the basic problem is that there's no mechanism in place to reward smaller forest owners for increasing carbon sequestration. And the scope of this problem is fairly considerable, given the fact that 40% of Minnesota timberland is actually in private non-industrial ownerships. So one way to incentivize carbon sequestration is through the sale of carbon offsets. The problem is that these economically marginal forest ownerships are largely excluded from carbon offset markets due to the high costs of market entry. So the goal of this project is to improve access to carbon markets for excluded forest ownerships. And one thing that we're really excited about is the fact that this project addresses all three impact goals through incentivizing carbon-centric forest management and offsetting greenhouse gas emissions through those practices. We're helping to build a carbon-neutral Minnesota, building future sustainable land use that mitigates and adapts to climate change. And then there's important co-benefits of improved forest management in terms of drinking water quality. So activity one in this project is the fact that carbon markets are quite complicated and in many ways not very transparent. Many landowners in Minnesota don't even know that they exist. And so activity one is to basically translate that complicated information into understandable materials that could be passed on to landowners and policymakers. And then one of the interesting facts is that Minnesota has really lagged behind neighboring states like Wisconsin and Michigan in terms of participation in carbon markets. So it's important to take a look at existing carbon offset projects in the state in terms of determining what actually works with respect to the types of forests we have and the management practices in place. So then activity 3 will be largely a function of our community partner, in which they will be convening workshops to transfer the information that we acquire through activities 1 and 2 to landowners that might be considering participation in carbon markets. And an overarching goal is to use the Minnesota Association of Resource Conservation and Development Councils as a means to facilitate low-cost carbon project development, in the sense that they would become a lead organization. So why now? Why is this important? Well, a number of large Minnesota-based corporations have embraced goals of carbon neutrality. And so we think there's just a huge opportunity to, link these companies who have these ambitious goals with actual forest landowners in terms of translating carbon offset projects into reality. So that's all I have for your folks, and we can take some questions.
Questions?
So, Chris, this is a really interesting project. From one of your early slides, you said that private forest, I'm not saying it right, but private forest landowners, those private forests are underperforming in terms of carbon sequestration, I think you said.
Right.
So is that in terms of the carbon markets or the actual plants on the landscape, or am I misunderstanding that part of it?
I guess that would be plants on the landscape. There's quite a bit of potential actually to plant new forest on private lands. There are management practices that could increase sequestration rates, thinning, planting of longer-lived species. And then there's sort of a change in long-term management practices that could be implemented that would qualify for carbon market offsets. So in some sense, encouraging a shift in practices over the long term.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Sure.
And just to add to what Chris is saying, this is Marissa, and the reality is that a lot of management on forest lands requires some sort of revenue to support the management activity. So that's one opportunity that a non-extractive carbon-based revenue could support, is some of those management activities on private forest lands that could facilitate more carbon sequestration.
This is Linda. I stuck a item in the chat that I think this growing climate solutions legislation at the federal level might be, this project sort of answers part of the questions or does the work that legislation hopes for. So really good timing. I have another question though that relates both to this project and Susanna's project about, like this one seems to be perhaps more focused on getting the dollars into the hands of the landowner, and I'm just curious if to what extent can we assure that the dollars that are made possible by these carbon markets actually benefit the landowners who need to do the, apply the practices. There are a lot of examples of the capital getting concentrated elsewhere. So I think that's consistent. I think that's your goal here with this project. And I just like to contrast the two carbon market proposals a little bit, or see where that goal fits in both of them.
Well, in terms of, you're absolutely right in terms of concentration of capital, because the carbon market project implementation is dominated by, a handful of project developers, and their methodologies, their approaches are not very transparent at all. And so there really needs to be, in a sense, an open source community of carbon project developers. And so that's kind of part of our vision for this project and our community partner. And there's some really good examples of entities like King County in Washington, so that's the greater Seattle area, that are actually getting into the carbon market business on their own and selling offsets.
If I can just
county lands. So yeah.
If I can just add to that, Chris, I think the current situation is that most of the carbon projects that are being developed are, I think they are genuine and in that they're actually doing something, but they are largely going to, you need maybe 30 or 40,000 acres land under a single manager to qualify. And so those people may be able to sequester a lot of carbon, but that's not reaching most of the landowners in the United States who own much less than that. So.
And also one additional point to respond to your question is that one of the things that helps the carbon market in North America work in some ways better than carbon markets elsewhere in the world, especially in developing countries or the global south, is that we have clear property rights or clearer property rights, which does help more of the revenue from carbon offsets or carbon credit sales go to the landowner themselves, especially when we're talking about private landowners.
So what's the average size of these private landowner forest holders in Minnesota? I mean, you mentioned, forest, you mentioned like, these really big ones of 30,000, but is it a couple hundred acres here or how much? What's a typical small owner that you're kind of looking at here?
I think I'll defer to Marissa on that.
Yeah, in the lake states, we have smaller ownerships on our private non-industrial forest landowners. So a couple hundred acres, anywhere from 40 acres to a couple hundred acres would be typical of a non-industrial private landowner in Minnesota, which is different than non-industrial private landowners in the Pacific Northwest, and is one of the reasons why developing projects here has been more challenging historically, and why there's more of a need for assistance in potentially pooling landowners together, finding other ways to reduce the development cost to make projects more financially feasible.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Any other questions? We can move on.
Right, I'll just want to make a quick comment regarding, so my name is Dave Wilsey. I used to actually be with the Extension Forestry team for about 5 years and dealt a lot with small landowners and landholders, forest property owners. And I worked a lot on non-timber forest products, and some of the things that you're talking about with regard to the carbon market resonate with some of the issues that we had with other non-timber benefits from forested landscapes. And one of the things that's always struck me as problematic in the NTFP, non-timber forest product realm, is that there's a tendency to isolate the products and try to develop markets in isolation, but those benefits are always so small relative to the timber benefit that they're insignificant and they don't merit a lot of attention. And I think what I'm hearing a little bit in terms of the carbon is that when you've got smaller landholders, you can aggregate through cooperative work, but that may or may, that's a different type of problem than kind of just demonstrating that there's a significant amount of benefit on the land. So all of which is to get to the point of that, has there been any thought given, or maybe there could be some thought given to looking beyond just the carbon benefits and trying to aggregate it with a portfolio of other non-timber benefits on the landscape and develop those things in tandem or in a group? And across land holdings, that might be a way to kind of aggregate beyond just the kind of marginal benefit of just a small carbon market for a smallholder. I mean, that sounds in itself inherently complicated and difficult to do, but I figured I might as well say it just because it's been a frustrating thing for us with NTFPs for years. So it might have some.
I think that's a great point. And one of the good things about the North American carbon market is that it was designed to work. Carbon revenue generation was designed to work in tandem with timber harvest revenue. So that's one thing that can help projects pencil out or be more attractive to landowners. There's sometimes less of an opportunity cost, so they're not always having to make decisions about one versus another. But the other thing that would help with what you're talking about is development of markets for other ecosystem services, whether it's water quality or quantity or wildlife habitat or biodiversity, but providing landowners with a way to layer those ecosystem service revenue streams would definitely make carbon projects more feasible.
Bundling is the word I was looking for, but couldn't find at the time that I was talking.
And yeah, if I can interject, to me, that's what's so exciting about green bonds is so that would be a mechanism to finance that bundling. So we're just super excited that there's a green bonds project.
Yes, Fred, we're stitching it all together.
The green bonds are a way of concentrating the capital without necessarily concentrating the land ownership. And given the size of some of the projects like an anaerobic digester, you do need to concentrate the capital because for smaller parcels, it's just not going to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm excited to connect with you also, Chris.
Yeah, and the bigger picture, I think it's just super exciting that Minnesota, the big Minnesota corporations are interested in getting to carbon neutral, and then, we have green bonds and we have tremendous potential with forests. So I think there's a great opportunity for us all to work together, and especially we're super excited that IonE can be a locus for us to reach out to other potential partners.
Cool, excellent. So we're gonna move on to Dave Wilsey to talk about the working ranch at the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. We'll take a short break after that. I didn't mention, but in addition to this, we've also, there's also been some work going on with Minnesota EQB on some of the water stuff, and we'll take a minute to talk about that too at the end, or more than a minute, but want to make sure you stick around for that too. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dave.
Great, okay. Hello everybody, my name is Dave Wilsey. I'm at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and I direct a program called the Masters of Development Practice, talking about the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe Ranch Project, which is in fact a ranch project, but it's a little bit of a misnomer because there's a lot of things going on, as I'm going to share with you in a second. I'm speaking on behalf of a team of folks, John Houle from Mille Lacs Band Department of Agriculture, Susan Bolio with Extension, and Molly Zins, who I think is on the call with their Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships. I'm actually the latecomer to this project. I joined early this year through a connection made through one of my graduate students who was an RA on the project. So if when we get to the questions, there's some kind of deep history work that you want to learn about, I think I'm going to defer to Molly. But right now, I'll just give you a quick overview of what we're thinking about with the work. Actually, before I do that, I kind of went too far, too fast there. So I'm just going to pause for a second. I just first want to mention the fact that Mille Lacs has a large land holding that used to be a ranch. And that ranch is adjacent to some forest land and some silvopasture land and some protected area land that expands kind of the impact area of the ranch considerably. Right now, I think that they've been holding that ranch for about 5 years in fallow state. It used to be a productive cattle ranch. It is no longer. And they're trying to figure out what to do with it. All of which is to say, this work is focused primarily on kind of the agricultural impact goal, but it clearly has connections to the watershed. There's a giant lake. There's lots of water system up there. And then also through agriculture and some of the earlier comments that were made about the carbon footprint of agriculture to that as well. So I think also I would like to just kind of editorialize before I get into the actual details of the project and say that one of the things that I've had the good fortune and privilege to be able to work on over my career a lot is community development, or our community development efforts in Indigenous communities throughout the Americas. So I spent 5 years working with tribal communities in Minnesota specifically, and about 15 years prior to that working in Latin America with mostly Indigenous communities. And I mention that because one of the things, at the risk of generalizing, one of the things that has come up in just about every situation, although the details of the project work and the details of the context vary greatly, is this realization that the interventions as typically developed for community development or forestry development or economic development tend to be too narrow, and they tend to be problematically siloed into whatever kind of expertise area that is desired or change is desired, right? And so there's always this craving for work that is more holistic, that is more in tune with the worldview and the ways of being and living in the communities, and that allow communities to express kind of the full way of being, in an agricultural context, as I'm about to talk about, beyond just food production, but also in terms of educating youth, incorporating and respecting elders, talking about seasonality, talking about stages of life, food, and all these different issues being tied together in the work. And that's a really hard thing to do. And so one of the things that the Ranch Project is trying to do is to address some of these kind of typically siloed interventions in this vision that has come out of the Mille Lacs community for what this space can be. So the core challenge we're facing is the creation of a socially, ecologically, economically interconnected community intervention strategy that is both generative, but also kind of looking at the larger and historical landscape, regenerative for the land, for the economy, and for the culture. We're drawing on, or using kind of as a guiding light, a framework that was developed by the American Indian Cancer Foundation around food and health, and thinks about fostering change in a good way, right? So that it centers on natural food systems, or natural systems rather, and in this case, we're talking about a natural food producing system. It's respectful and inclusive of life stages, and it's really thinking about how to weave all stages of life into the socio-ecological system. It's seasonally guided, and has a nuanced and complete vision of well-being, right? So it's not just about the wellness of the land, but it's also about the wellness of the individual and the community at large. The project then extends on that to deal with some foundations, right? There's this guiding framework that is built up on underlying foundations that are rooted in Indigenous beliefs, right? So the idea is that when all four of these are present and in balance, the people and planet are able to achieve their full well-being. And these four framework pieces or these four elements of the framework rather, are what is necessary to reclaim those connections between food and health, broadly speaking. So in this project, more specifically, what we're trying to do is weave together three really important kind of challenge areas and areas of desired investment within the Mille Lacs community. And one of those is youth learning and development. Another is this agricultural space, food production, food sovereignty, traditional foods and well-being. And then the third is a recovery and rehabilitation center that's designed principally to reintegrate nonviolent offenders and addicts into a productive community status, right? It's a ramp way back into kind of healthy community life. And so the idea or the question that drives this work is, can this be done through it's really a multifaceted strategy that centers on a single kind of space. And that space in this case is the Mille Lacs Ranch. And so to do that, it's really working simultaneously in these three areas, and our project is designed to explore in concert each of these three areas. So it's a question of, can we construct a working farm, a socio and ecologically and economically feasible working farm that provides an opportunity and space for youth learning and development intergenerationally through work done by and in concert with the folks participating in the Recovery and Rehabilitation Center. So we have these four kind of active spaces: active culturally grounded learning, active culturally grounded recovery and rehabilitation, intergenerational engagement and transfer, and a system that's grounded, number 4, in traditional and natural food system practices. So rather than thinking of it simply as a ranch project, it's all of these things happening through the development of a ranch and education and rehabilitation center. And the work that we're going to be doing, this is my last slide, I can pause there and let questions come, but the work that we're going to be doing largely, because this is a very nascent endeavor, is trying to think about how this has to look, or what it needs to be like to be economically successful, ecologically successful, and then socially successful, or more specifically, culturally successful within the Mille Lacs community. And so we're going to be spending a lot of time doing community consultations early on to shape the vision beyond kind of the general sense of where we are right now. And then we're going to be working a lot with student teams and researchers to look at the feasibility, financial feasibility and ecological footprint of what these things might look like. And can they be sustained with some of the parameters that are being advocated for the cultural conditions that need to be met. And I'll pause there. I have other slides I could talk more about, but I think I'll refrain from those and bring them in if needed for questions.
Great, thanks, Dave. We'll open it up for questions. Questions?
Oh, sorry, Fred. Could you speak, like I'd love to hear more about the recovery and rehabilitation aspect, partially because there's a parcel of land in the east to north side of St. Paul that also is potentially becoming available to do that for a local correctional facility. And so I'd just love to hear more about that aspect.
You know, I don't think, I'm going to just check and see if Susan was able to join us. Susan Bolio is the one who is kind of spearheading that aspect of the work. She's not, I just kind of scanned through the participant list. I don't see her there. So Molly, I'm going to say something, and if you can jump in if I'm not capturing your understanding of this. But the way I understand the recovery and rehabilitation aspect of it is that the vision as it kind of is currently sitting is that the ranch itself will be run by people in recovery and rehabilitation. So they will essentially be the effective staff for the ranch. They will be, and this is probably the more uncertain and perhaps contentious component of it, they will be also in some way kind of the mentors, which I think I can say oddly enough perhaps, but like the mentors for the youth who are going to be coming in with regard to the ranch and farming work. So they will be leading the youth education activities in terms of the technical skills that are associated with the ranch operations. And so there'll be this kind of, if you can imagine it in buildings, because the vision is for it to be in different buildings, there'll be almost like an environmental learning center, which would be the youth center. There'll be a dorm or a living space for the recovery and rehabilitation co-located on the property and separately located on the property. And then they will meet in the space of the agricultural realm, right? And then they will be working through that, but they'll also be receiving within that edifice of where they're going to be working. They'll be receiving counseling and doing the recovery and rehabilitation work that you might expect to see in a more kind of clinical setting. But then they'll be working and kind of also mentoring through the agricultural work. Does that address what you're getting at? Or I know that's not a super detailed answer, but that's at least where the vision sits today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sure. And I should add that that's a lot of that is the work that Susan does through Extension, right? So that's her specific kind of area of expertise. So it's not, it actually, as I say it, it feels like a very risky and large thing to be trying to talk about doing. And it feels that way to me personally, but I know that for others who are working in that space, it seems much more feasible and manageable. And I think that that's an important part of that is the nonviolent offender aspect of it, and those who are in recovery from drug use typically.
Thank you. And it's like totally in line with what I hear from elders that I get to talk to as I move through the Lilith and Central neighborhoods. So that's just really cool that that like the foundation is happening for it.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Other questions?
I've just got a comment. So I had never heard of a theory of change when I initially read the RFP, but I think this is really neat in terms of the project we just heard about, and then the urban forest or urban agriculture, in the sense that improving people's lives, leads to greater environmental sustainability. So it seems like there's a cool synergy there in terms of theories of change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things, we're not going to have a chance to talk about it in this meeting, but Eric Lonsdorf, who's the lead on the land goal, and also involved with natural capital, is looking at some metric development for both the state and the city, together with some other people on this call and with the University of Vermont. And they're using this framework called donut economics, which is a way to think about sort of what you just said, right? Is to realize that, society's well-being, as we're seeing here, is built on a lot of things, right? I mean, there's environment, there's business aspect, there's social aspects, et cetera. And that's a really interesting way to start to tie those things together. We'll be talking about that more as we kind of go along with this process. But if you're interested in looking at it, I can send out some links to you. But I think this cohort is a really good example of that recognition, right? And we've seen that really happen with some of the stuff that's happened both with COVID and the uprisings here in Minnesota, that there's a lot of aspects to society's well-being, and we really need to not only look at all those, but tie those together. And that really does fit in with IonE's theory of change. I don't know if you want to say any more, Jessica, about that, and then we're going to take a break. Okay. All right,
Hey,
we're going to take, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jeff.
Just a quick add-on to that topic. Hennepin County, I believe, is involved in working on the Human Development Index, HDI, which I think is an overarching metric that kind of pulls all of that together. Eric Erickson, I believe, is the person's name, and I haven't talked to him in a while, but I'd be happy to connect anybody with him if you're interested in finding out what they're doing.
Cool. Any other questions for Dave on his project? Otherwise, we're going to take a few minutes. Thank you, David. All right, so we're going to come back. We're going to take a short break. Let me look at my agenda just so you can get up and stretch for a second. We're going to come back at 11:15, and then we have two more talks. We have Northeastern Minnesota farmers growing climate smart trees, and community engagement for drinking water protection, to hear from those, and then also to hear about some of the work that has gone on here to the EQB's 10-year water report. And so we'll come back and do that. So we'll start again at 11:15. Thanks. David, are you going to be doing the presentation? David Abbas?
No.
Brianna will be leading.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, let me know when you want me to get started, Fred.
Yeah, we said we'd start at 11:15, so I'll let you, you should be able to share the screen and
Got
go.
it. Let's see. Okay. So I'm here presenting on behalf of my group, which consists of myself and Julie Ederson at UMD in the biology department, Meredith Cornett at TNC, and David Abaz at the Northeastern Regional Sustainable Development Partnership. And we are working together to integrate Northeastern Minnesota farmers into growing climate smart trees for forest adaptation and mitigation. And we are addressing what our community partner, Meredith Cornett at the Nature Conservancy, has identified as an extreme bottleneck in the availability of climate smart trees to deal with climate change. And so this project is specifically designed to address this problem. This is a typical scene on the North Shore where you see dead and dying birches, and this is partially caused by an increasingly warming climate. And this is going to, of course, proceed in the coming decades. Predictions indicate that if things continue at pace in the coming decades, the climate of northeastern Minnesota will become very similar to the current climate of southeastern Minnesota. And of course, this has implications for what type of vegetation we might see in the future. In southeastern Minnesota right now, we have this prairie landscape. In northeastern Minnesota, we have this mixed boreal forest. But we really have a need to maintain trees on the landscape in northeastern Minnesota for their economic and their ecological services that they provide. And so that means we have a strong need for climate smart trees that will thrive in a warming climate, but there aren't enough of them available. And so our project, our group is working to lay the groundwork to transition Minnesota's forests to climate readiness with the help of local growers in northeastern Minnesota. So this is our theory of change. Right now we have a climate vulnerable forest, and that means the related economies and ecologies are also vulnerable to a changing climate. We'd like to get to resilient, diverse forests and a thriving regional economy that's sustainable into the future. And this is going to require several steps. First, we need training on best practices for the collection of climate adaptive tree seeds. We need the development of a new production model for tree seedlings that is hopefully diffuse on the landscape and also regionally located. We need information on climate-informed seed sourcing policies so we know which seeds work best once they've been collected. And then we need to develop a really robust supply chain for this adaptation economy that's going to have to continue into the future. And so our project combines scientific expertise, outreach to a regional growers network, and then work with our community partner, the Nature Conservancy, to actually get trees onto the landscape. So in the coming year, we have two goals to get started on this big change that we'd like to see. The first thing we're starting to do is to fill some of the gaps in our scientific knowledge, and that's something that Julie Ederson and I are mainly working on. And then we're working to reduce the seedling production bottleneck, and that's a really work where David is taking the lead, and he can answer questions about that in just a second here. And this is all to provide our community partner with these climate adapted seedlings to plant directly onto the landscape on Nature Conservancy land. So this right now, we've actually already started working. We're locating populations of trees that we can collect seeds from. And David is working with a network of farmers who will provide, serve as our growers network eventually to grow those seeds. This fall, we're going to start collecting the seeds. And then over the winter, we'll be working on germination protocols and then also working to train our farmers how to grow these plants. And then in the spring, we'll be ready to distribute these seeds to farmers. And then also with those seeds, Julie and I will establish a common garden experiment so we can scientifically evaluate which seeds are going to do best, which seedlings are going to survive in this area. And that will lead to future work that will support, hopefully with future grant applications, and then also work that's ongoing with the SDP, sorry, always get those mixed up, and future applications that we'll put in together. This project, we feel, has implications for all of these important impact goals: carbon sequestration in forests, sustainable land use planning through getting these forests ready for climate change and integrating local growers, and then achieving safe drinking water by protecting these ecosystems that filter our water. So again, we don't have all our partners here today. Neither Meredith nor Julie could be present due to other commitments, but David is here and he can answer questions along with me if you guys have anything that you wanted to know more about. Let's see.
Yep, go ahead, David.
I'm wondering, Dave, Abaz, perhaps you're the one I should direct this question to. Could you or would you be willing to just briefly characterize what the supply chain looks like right now for trees? I'm fascinated. I mean, I should know that because of the work that I said that I did before, but I actually don't. And then I'm curious, what would you say drives what's produced today? Like, what's the kind of the characteristic of the commodity, if you will, that makes production decisions happen in the current system?
Right. Well, I think one of our partners, Nature Conservancy, they're planting 600,000 trees this year, and they're just one of the players, and they get their trees from Canada largely, and then a few Western Coast seedling operations. In order to get the trees they want, they actually send the seed up to Canada so that they're growing the trees. And I think that's one thing that Brianna understated her work and her vital work on securing the seeds, in that, you know, we're looking at a greater diversity of individuals within a species to be the most adaptive to the changing climate. We've already gotten, some of our region is up 5 degrees from its typical temperature. And so having not only a diversity between species, but also diversity within the genetic seed base of the trees being planted. So right now, what has been really motivating the seed collection is get as much seed quickly to sell, to have them grown without the consideration for what genetic basis, the number of individuals and the diversity within the same species of individuals that are being growing. So what we'll be growing are actually different trees than what is typically being grown, in that they'll represent a broader genetic basis.
Yeah, and if I could just comment here, Dave, that's a really interesting question that Julie and I have been, learning about and thinking about for a while now. And some of the seedling, not for the Nature Conservancy, but as you may know, and as other people on this meeting may know, a lot of seed collection in Minnesota is driven by established seed zones that are followed by the DNR Division of Forestry. And with good intention, it's difficult to bring in seeds that are not from those seed zones, even though that might be what we need for climate adaptation into the future. And so this is a really great opportunity for us to really get on the ground and figure out what kind of seedlings are going to thrive in northern Minnesota, northeastern Minnesota with climate change without those constraints. And I can talk about those more if you're interested in hearing about them. And I just want to add, Chris, I was really interested to see your presentation. I think there might be room for cooperation as we get this operation up and going to provide some seedlings to local landowners as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really excited to see that your project was funded. And, yeah, we need to talk.
Yes, yeah.
We have time for one more question. Forrest typed the question in. I don't know, David and Brianna, if you can see that, but Forrest, you're welcome to unmute and ask it too.
Yeah, so the question is about about, you know, the economic implications of this, market implications. So there's this huge investment in milling capacity, and you can't just shift over to a different species. I think that's a really great point. And so a lot of our seed collections are actually going to focus on staying within the same species, but collecting from more southerly populations of that same species. So if we have a species that's predicted to increase in prominence, let's make sure that we're planting seeds that will actually thrive in that new economy. But definitely, I think us being more informed about what people want for that economic application would be really helpful. So I'd be interested in learning a lot more about that from you, Forrest, and from other people.
And the other thing I'd add is the ecological needs as well of forest canopy type, evergreen percent versus deciduous, how the wildlife and other things interact with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so diversifying the species and finding species that will provide a similar type of canopy for the wild ecosystems as well that we depend on for tourism and otherwise. So there's a lot of different factors along with the economic.
Mm-hmm.
And also just how much carbon is sequestered by the trees by having a healthy forest. Right now we're losing the spruce and the fir to spruce budworms. We're going to have more and more carbon released into the atmosphere. So how can we build a really resilient, healthy forest by creating them more adapted to the changing environment? That's kind of the ultimate goal.
So this is just a nerdy question. To what extent might epigenetics play a role in terms of climate adaptation? And is that something you'll get at with the Common Gardens?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this, especially the, you know, the effect of the maternal parent and its environment that translates into phenotypes in these seedlings that we have to try to control for by having multiple mothers. I think it's difficult to answer that question completely. Definitely genetic work in forest trees has shown that there is a genetic basis, a heritable genetic basis for this adaptation. But I definitely think that maternal effect and that transgenerational plasticity may have a major effect that we might be able to get out we might be able to suss out by maintaining a common garden for a long enough time. But yeah, it's a great question.
Great, thanks. If there's more questions, you can reach out to Brianna and David directly. We have to move on to the next and the final one of the 6, community engagement around drinking water in Greater Minnesota. Who's on to do that? I'm not sure I see everybody on the team. Is there a representative from that group? Barrett, do you know who's supposed to be presenting? Okay. So this is May Davenport's project. Must not have been able to make it.
Hi, this is Emily Kreider. May did say that she had designated someone to talk about this project, but I don't know who that person was.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to move on to the last part of the agenda, which was some of the work that we've been doing through people associated with the drinking water goal on the EQB's 10-year report. So I'm not sure who's going to start with that. Is that you, Amelia, or?
Yeah, I can start.
Okay.
Let me share my screen quickly. All right. Can you see my screen? Oh no. Hang on, sorry. Are you able to see my screen? I cannot tell.
Yeah.
I have multiple screens.
Yeah,
open. I'm not sure which one is.
Well, we're seeing your sort of your preview, not the main.
Oh, got it. Okay, hang on. I think I can fix that. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, great. Okay, sorry. So hi, I'm Emily Crater. May couldn't be here today. She's on like a 10-hour Zoom call for a peer review meeting. I am a PhD student in NRSM in the Department of Forest Resources. And I'll be talking about our part of the EQB Climate and Water 2020 State Water Plan. So the EQB, I don't know how much everyone knows about this, but they every 10 years release a state water plan. This was the cover photo of the 2010 plan, and this year's focus is going to be water and climate. So how does climate change and variability impact water management, and how can we sustainably manage water? So just a little background on the Center for Changing Landscapes. Our focus is primarily social science research through qualitative interviews, social science surveys, and then ultimately directing that work towards planning and policy. So the meta-analysis that we focused on for this work was focused on these 5 surveys. The first was a 2018 statewide water value survey. The first, I believe the first statewide resident survey focused on water values. We sent it out to 6,000 residents and got a response of 1,500 respondents. The second is an agricultural survey in the Bonanza Valley and Straight River groundwater management areas, looking at groundwater supply in those areas from climate changes. And then 2 North Shore resident and North Shore visitor surveys examining coastal community readiness for future climate changes. And then lastly, an on-site survey in the Twin Cities with an N of 411 focused with a focus on obtaining a Black, Indigenous, and people of color sample, which we ended up being able to get almost 300. Whoops. All right, so our first finding is that Minnesotans value water. We know this from the Clean Water Land Legacy Act, and found through our survey, found through our survey that first and foremost, Minnesotans value drinking water, followed by future generations, fish and wildlife habitat, safe beaches and lakes, and downstream pollution. So this is kind of a look at all of the values that we asked. There were 17 items that we asked in the statewide resident survey. And drinking water and future generations were by far significantly most important to Minnesotans. We asked the same question in the on-site resident survey. So we found that there were significant differences in gender across, I believe, 14 of the 17 items. And we're still looking at why that is. But we also see that the top 5 values are still the same regardless. And so again, the same question was asked in the on-site resident survey. And we find that there are also significant differences in 8 out of 10 of the items between people of color and white people in the Twin Cities. This is sort of an ongoing project, so full analysis isn't done on these demographic groups so far. Oops. So second, we find that Minnesotans are aware and concerned about climate change impacts. So we find, excuse me, we find that there are stronger beliefs, particularly in sensitive communities in Minnesota. So those North Shore residents and visitors that see more frequent intense weather events, Twin Cities people of color that are disproportionately impacted by climate change, water pollution, air pollution, and then central Minnesota ag producers who are using more and more irrigation due to drought events or due to flood events. So you see here that 66% of Minnesota residents believe that climate change is happening, according to the Yale poll. And in all of those demographic groups I just mentioned, climate change belief is higher. And this graph doesn't show the split between those that believe climate change is occurring due to human caused impacts versus natural changes in the environment, just that these people do believe that the climate is changing. So here we see that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are very to extremely concerned about climate change, 73%, and 87% believe climate change impacts to water are a moderate to severe problem. And we find that these groups are also significantly more concerned than white respondents about water damage to their homes and drinking water contamination. And we know that these groups have also historically been excluded from the water decision-making process and are disproportionately impacted by these climate impacts and by the contamination to the water supply. So lastly, so this was a quote from a North Shore interviewee back in 2018, I believe. How do we protect water for our communities and for future generations? How do we restore them? And how do we prepare them for changes like climate change? So the question here is not whether we should do something or who is responsible, but how we can protect our resources. And in many of these communities, we're finding that it's coming down to community organizing and community action around water justice. So with that, I'd like to thank IonE and all of the different researchers that worked on all of these projects. Thank you.
Kate, since you're on, can you give a little better context to what Emily was presenting and what you're going to present than I did? You're on mute.
Why, yes, I'd be happy to. Barrett, I think my slides are part of your slide deck, although I can also share them from Google Slides, whichever's easier.
And if there's questions for Emily, obviously, but I'll let you go first, Kate.
Sure. Well, let's see if this works. Can you see a picture of the 2010 State Water Plan? So as it turns out, Minnesota has a lot of water, cares about a lot about water, and has a bunch of legislative mechanisms by which we govern our water. One of those is that the Minnesota Environmental Quality Board, which is an intergovernmental agency, the heads of all of the agencies in Minnesota that really have anything to do with the environment sit on the Minnesota Environmental Quality Board, as do citizen members. And the EQB is legislatively required to produce a state water plan every 10 years. The last one was in 2010, so we are moving into the 2020 state water plan. As any of you who pay attention to water in Minnesota might have noticed, there are approximately 6,000 water plans in Minnesota about various constituents in water. And in conversation with the agencies and the board itself, EQB decided that the 2020 state water plan should be focused on water and climate change. So something that was quite different than what some of those other documents have been. So there's a nitrogen plan, there are stormwater plans. If you want background on those, we did a really nice landscape assessment. Andrew Butts gets a lot of credit for that. So ping me if you'd like that. We did produce that. And as the EQB started working on the 2020 state water plan, they approached a number of folks at the University of Minnesota and said, hey, we would like to incorporate research on water and climate in our research. And so the way this plan is structured has changed over time, but it's really focused on the agencies and also on the legislature as its users. And it presents a set of potential actions that the government could take to help Minnesota be better prepared for changing climate and its effects on water. And so what they came to IonE and the Water Resources Center and the Center for Changing Landscapes and the Humphrey School for was to say, hey, can you help us make sure we are really integrating the best research at the university into the water plan? So even though many of you are at the university, you might have noticed that the university is not a monolith, and that in fact, there's not actually a directory of these things. And so with Barrett Colombo, we really set about trying to identify and integrate some of the research from across the university that could inform this plan. And what we wanted to know was what water and climate related research is going on, and can we connect that to some of these actions that the report is proposing. And we did not in any way try to do an exhaustive set of research, but really a snowball approach, which we've talked to some of you. If you have climate and water related research and we didn't talk to you, come talk to us. So we made this crazy spreadsheet that we then inflicted on EQB. I will not inflict that on you. But what we've done is try to take some of these big issues that EQB is interested in and wants to highlight, questions like, how do we manage our landscapes to improve water quality, and tie them and inform them from research that's happening at the U. So specific projects on perennial grains, on soil health, and a wide variety of researchers who are working on that. So this is obviously partly related to, landscapes and increasing storms, but it's also about fisheries and what's happening to our aquatic ecosystems. So we can also link this to research on changing aquatic habitats. And we can even think about sort of future solutions, thinking about banking groundwater and managed aquifer recharge and some of the work that's going on there, and other things that are happening at the Water Resources Center. So this is really just sort of a sample, a taste of some of the research that we're working with to make sure it gets integrated into and informs this water plan. And that's going to happen in a couple different ways. The plan itself is going to be very short. It's designed to be a super readable short document. So we'll have just a couple sort of 1 or 2 sentence references to some of these projects in the plan. And then what EQB is looking to do is really support kind of a library, a web library of plain language summaries of what these projects are with contact information for the researchers so that we can help folks in government who are interested in connecting with researchers understand what's happening. And then really, I like to think of this as making the Rolodexes bigger, because lots of people have individual connections with individual agencies or individual researchers. And what we'd really like to do is widen that, so IonE can kind of serve as a connector and a networker for both the agencies and the folks at the university.
Any questions or comments for either Kate or Emily?
Hey, Kate. This is Jessica. Can you tell us a little bit about the EQB side? So how are they feeling and thinking about like this, what you just described?
They're delighted. So if any of you have ever worked with EQB, they're a fantastic organization. It's actually very cool that they exist and that there is this mechanism for folks who are thinking about the environment in different agencies to come together. And they're also a pretty shoestring operation. They don't have a lot of staff. And they're a political organization. They're responding to all of these agencies. And so over the course of about a year that this project has been going on, they've replaced the director of EQB. They've replaced the staff that's working on this. They've completely reimagined what this report should look like based on sort of iterative conversations with the agencies and the legislature. So it's an ever-changing beast, which is, you know, both fun and frustrating, I would say, from the perspective of a researcher. But what we've heard consistently from the staff, even as the staff has changed, is that this is exactly what they're excited about. They know that this research exists, they know it's important, and they don't have the capacity to interpret it to make it useful for them. And so the more that we can say, all right, there was a study that said this, and this is what it means. And it's that translation of this is what it means, because they just don't have the capacity to read all those papers and make those interpretations themselves.
I should mention, I need to mention actually to just want to recognize Kate. Kate has been leading our water goal, or focus on drinking water for the last couple of years, but has a new plan going forward and some pretty exciting news. Do you want to just share that, Kate?
Sure. So I have accepted a fellowship through the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. They have a Science Technology Policy Fellowship, which lets scientists spend a year or two working in the federal government to both help get science into government and learn about government to bring that back to the academy. So I am headed, well, sort of headed, everything's a little weird because of COVID, but I'm headed to Washington to work for the Department of Defense on climate and water security, starting in September.
Anybody can straighten them out, it's you, Kate.
We'll see what happens. But I asked a lot of questions and they said there's a ton of political support for, at least internal political support for being climate and water resilient and ready on their bases. They all know that Norfolk is sinking and they need to do something about it.
Yeah, it's a pretty exciting move. Really, it's great that you're able to do that.
I'm really delighted to have the opportunity, and I am maintaining my U affiliation. I'm not gone, so.
Sure.
No tears.
So I think we're going to wrap up here. I appreciate everybody who joined the call. We had very good participation. I really appreciate those of you who are presenting and talking about your projects, the work that you've done, the work that you're planning to do. You know, it's great to see the interaction between people. As I've told the grantees, you know, these are not huge grants, but they are opportunities to start to create some of the interaction that you saw here today. There, you know, the university is a big and complicated place. There's lots of work going on that all of us is new to all of us all the time. I don't know about you, but I'm always learning about people and things that it's like, really? We do that? And so this is an opportunity to start bringing people around the work that they do. And, you know, Chris has mentioned that a couple of times in some of his questions. All of this work is really interrelated. And, you know, we all use the word sustainability, and none of us probably could ever really give a good definition for it. Or if we did, we'd have 40 different ones. And I think what we're seeing here is an example of that there are lots of pieces, and one of our jobs as IonE is to really try to start to tie some of those together, and that really will make real impact, which is really what we're trying to do here. So again, thanks everybody for joining. I think the next time there is a IonE annual meeting that's coming up the end of September. As always, you know, in the last couple of years, we've had some breakouts around the impact goals. That is not going to be the case this year. But, you know, you will have a chance to get some updates next month. The teams will be doing some focus co-creation workshops. And then probably not another update like this until after the holidays. But again, thanks everybody. And I'm really looking forward to what all these great projects are going to be doing. So thanks everybody. Any last comments or words anybody want to put in? Great, thanks. Continue to have a great and safe summer. Stay safe, be well. Bye.